Hi, everyone. Welcome to CORWEX's National Conference 2021. We are so excited to have you here. And we are so excited to bring back one of our favorite guests. He was, I know we heard resoundingly from you from Leadership Conference how incredible it was to hear from him. And it is Dr. Bruce Lanphear. By way of introduction, Dr. Lanphear is an MD and MPH. He's actually a professor of health sciences at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, British Columbia, one of the most beautiful places in the world. And his goal in all of his work is to help prevent disease that can be caused by lead, but also by other toxic chemicals. And probably, and Dr. Lanphear, you can speak to this, but really your big motivating factor is our failure to really control this pandemic of chronic disease that can be a result of widespread exposure to these harmful pollutants, toxic chemicals, excess consumption of those chemicals. And in fact, you have some incredible videos that you produce as well. So welcome again to our national conference. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
So, one of the things I would love, or I guess initiatives I would love to talk about, is this idea of little things matter. It's something that a number of years ago, when we were first exposed to it and learned a little bit more about it, it intuitively it made so much sense. But there may be people out there that have not heard of this concept of little things matter. And I think it's really, in some ways, it forms the foundation of a lot of the research you've done on harmful chemicals. So wondering if you can just touch a little bit on that, this idea of parts per billion, which seems so minute, but maybe isn't as minute.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and the whole idea of little things matter really came out of two things. One is that little people matter, little children matter,
Mhm.
and more often we put so many of our resources into the system once people are already sick. And we know that a lot of chronic diseases begin early in life. Even if children are resilient, those conditions become manifest, certainly in childhood, but in adulthood as well. And so Little Things Matter really began as Children Matter. Uh, Also, it's this idea of extremely low levels or concentrations of chemicals can have a big impact on our health. And we try to talk about that a few different ways. One of them is just to compare the concentrations of chemicals that are found in the environment, like lead, like mercury, like DDT, which is still found in many of us, with the concentrations that are there for chemicals that are used as therapeutic drugs. And the concentration is not all that different in many cases. It's very similar. And so, on one level, the drug companies, which at one point were really one and the same with the chemical industry. It started with the chemical industry, and then those they spun off into drug companies, and so they have the same origins. And so the many of the chemical companies will dismiss these toxic chemicals in our environment as being too low to be of any consequence. But
Right.
it falls apart when you realize that the concentrations of these toxic chemicals in the environment are comparable to the chemicals used as therapeutic drugs. There's another aspect of this little things matter that is important to recognize, and it's almost counterintuitive. Most of our resources, our health dollars, our research dollars go into treating disease once it's already the symptoms and signs are already present. There's this epidemiologist, Jeffrey Rose, who came up with this really profound concept that mostly is ignored today. And that is the majority of death, disease, and disability occurs among people who are low to moderate risk. And what
Mm.
that means is these subtle impacts that we oftentimes dismiss add up. And they add up in part because so many more people are exposed to these subtle risks. But subtle risks in tens of millions of people, oftentimes at a population level, are much more important than big risks in a few people, right? And so, because we're so focused on disease care, disease management, and not on prevention, the ultimate problem is by focusing only on the diseases, we're failing to prevent them in the first place because we ignore the exposures that happen down here, and then we start fighting about this risk factor being better than that risk factor. But ultimately, whether you're talking about preterm birth or asthma or heart disease, all of these conditions result from the cumulative impact, oftentimes the cumulative impact of many subtle risk factors, but they add up.
So when you're talking about these elements adding up and comparing it to a pharmaceutical dose, can you give us an example? I know we've talked a little bit about even a birth control patch or another drug that at parts per billion can have a significant impact on the human body, right? When it's ingested to treat or prevent something from happening within the body. That parts per billion, although it seems really small, it does have an impact. And to your point, it has an impact cumulatively over time. Are there examples from your research of that concept that you saw played out?
Yeah, we just as a way of trying to give people a sense of what do we mean when we talk about parts per billion. Um, 2 tablespoons of sugar in an Olympic-sized swimming pool is equivalent to about 1 part per billion, right? So it is an exceedingly small amount, um, at least at first blush. And so for a long time, the our regulatory agencies like the EPA and the FDA, and certainly the chemical industries have dismissed those. They're too small, too low to be of any consequence. What we now know 50 years later is that all the evidence points to exactly the opposite, that even at these extraordinarily low concentrations, they can gum up the system. They
Mhm.
can, even at parts per trillion for endocrine uh, 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 the endocrine system, whether it's thyroid, or whether it's leptin, which has a role in obesity. I mean, we're even
Right.
finding chemicals that have an impact on whether people will become obese. These are called obesogens. For a long time, we basically said, well, this is just because people don't exercise, they sit on their couch, or they eat wrong.
Right.
But we now know that there's many of these chemicals that can increase the risk of developing obesity. And you can see, for example, with things like bisphenol A, which is a chemical that's used in the linings of food cans, used to be in water bottles, um, or PFCs, these forever chemicals that have been in the
Right.
news a lot. Those are obesogens. If the developing fetus is exposed to high levels of those, they are more likely to be born small, but then there's this catch up that happens, this um, compensation. And by 7 or 8 years of age, these children are more likely to have a higher BMI, to have more fat cells. And these are at levels that we're exposed to today. So these obesogens are really concerning. And the obesity epidemic is not just about calories in, calories out.
Right. Just to stop on that for just a second or pause on that, we've read a little bit about that as well. And I think with the epidemic, it is more than just calories in, calories out, or intermittent fasting. There are so many, it's overwhelming for people. But to bring it back to this idea that you're impacting even at a parts per trillion level, impacting your body's ability to stay thin, stay metabolically active, stay fit, that's pretty
Yeah.
extraordinary. And I don't know, if this is an area that you've been researching, but are there hints and tips we could tell people to share with people to say, hey, if you're looking at, um, uh, you know, living a healthier lifestyle and that obesity is a concern, these may be some areas that you want to look at and avoid moving forward, because I know this is such a concern for people, and certainly through the pandemic where there tended to be less exercise and probably more eating from stress. Do you have any sorts of insights there for them?
Yes, and I mean, you pointed out that this is complex, and of course, it's complex even when we think of obesity or adiposity. But then on top of that, we worry about our brain health. We worry about our
Mm.
heart health. We worry, right. So each one of those, you can add more and more layers of complexity. And if we just for a moment focus on toxic chemicals, there are some things we can do that will overall reduce our risk of exposures and therefore reduce our risk of some of these health problems we've just talked about. Now, in some cases, the health implications aren't definitive, but they're sufficient to say, for many of the chemicals we now know are toxic, whether it's air pollution, whether it's lead, whether it's mercury, whether it's bisphenol A, or these forever chemicals, or the flame retardants, right? So there's dozens of these things where we have sufficient evidence to say that these are risk factors for these health problems. So to keep it from being overwhelming, what we talk about oftentimes, like in our video, is try to reduce your exposures to chemicals by choosing organic whenever possible. Avoid food packaging. Avoid canned foods. Don't use chemicals in and around the house. Certainly don't use pesticides. Don't smoke in and around the house. Be very careful about what you use to clean with. Right. So all of these things that we do day to day, if we can take these little steps, and it's not adding burden, it's replacing certain practices with other ones that will reduce our exposures to toxic chemicals. And what
Right.
we've done in our household, largely because of um, well, some of my concerns, some of my science, but really largely because of my wife Nancy making it happen, is that we are almost entirely free of canned foods in our house. Canned tuna is still probably the one thing that we still use in cans. Um, we used to have a problem with beans, canned beans, right? Because you have to
Right.
soak them overnight. But now we have an instant pot. Um,
Right.
we have moved away from certainly canned tomato sauce because you really want to be careful about those foods that are acidic. Uh, they that's why the canned food industry uses things like BPA to keep the metal and the acidic foods from the metal. Right, it's going to impact the
Uh-huh.
taste. And so, how do you get around that? Well, even with tomato sauce, for example, you can buy it in glass jars. And so
Mhm.
almost entirely we've been able to get away from prepackaged foods, um, foods with pesticides in them, synthetic pesticides anyway. There's some that are still used in organic food, but trying to come up with some simple steps that people can take without getting overwhelmed by the complexity of each of these areas.
Right, right, and it can be overwhelming, and I love what you're saying about food because if we even start with food as your medicine, if you will, the
Yeah.
idea of buying organic, the idea of looking in your pantry and making those choices that are not the stainless canned food. One quick question: what about the aseptic boxes? Like I get my tomatoes, crushed tomatoes in those boxes. Is that better? Worse? Is it anything that we should be concerned about?
I can't tell you specifically about the aseptic boxes. What I would tell you is two things. First of all, even for people who do this for a living, it's really hard to know everything. I haven't
Right,
looked into those, and the information oftentimes is proprietary. We have to
right.
dig in to figure it out, or we have to go take these boxes off the shelves and test them for these chemicals because that information isn't readily available. So, as a
Mhm.
simple rule, what I've done is to say, look, just wherever possible, avoid packaged foods, minimize uh, the use of conventional produce. So I don't have an answer for everything, but that's the way I
Right,
simplify things. At the
right.
same time, um, we do what we can. And when we go to a friend's house for dinner, or when we go out to a restaurant, we're not overzealous about it. We do what we can in our house, and then we don't, fret too much about it until we, at some point say, well, what about we could do this, and then we have
Right.
another simple solution that kind of moves us closer and closer to where we want to be. I think the other thing to bring out is that, we've been sold um, we've been sold this idea that it's more convenient, it's better to go to fast food restaurants. Uh, we go to fast food restaurants almost not at all. Maybe occasionally when we travel. Again, we're not overzealous about it. Uh, but there are these trade-offs. Yes, it might be more convenient, but you got to get in your car, or you got to, well, walking down the street would be fine. You got to get in your car. You got to go sit in a place that may not be particularly nice, like your home. You miss out on the opportunity when you go to fast food restaurants to cook together, right? You sit around the kitchen, you talk, you chat. Our kitchen
Mhm.
is the most used place in our household. And so it may not be as convenient. Maybe I spent 8 hours cooking that awesome lasagna, but I can use it now because I freeze two-thirds of it over 5 or 6 meals. And in the
Right.
process, Nancy and I got to be in the kitchen together. That's high quality stuff.
Right. Right. It's a mindset, isn't it? It's a mindset,
Yeah.
maybe change, kind of. Yeah, I love that. For people that may be thinking, well, what sort of impact could eating organic foods or unprocessed foods actually have in the body? I was reminded of a study that I think it was an informal study done in Sweden where they took two families or a series of families.
Mhm.
One was they were all eating traditional produce and they took their baseline measurements of a few chemicals, BPA in particular, some pesticides from their urine, and then they had them, I think it was for 4 or 6 weeks, eat just organic produce. And then they tested again, and they found significant reductions in
Yeah.
those particular chemicals in the body. So I'm always so impressed with that because you think, oh, it's going to take forever for this to actually have an impact, but realizing the body is just extraordinary in terms of its sensitivity and its
Yeah.
desire to be in homeostasis and really to be healthy. Your body wants that, right? So it
Yeah.
responds pretty quickly when you remove those elements that might be a challenge for it.
Right. And there's been studies like that that have looked at various pesticides,
Uh-huh.
various endocrine disrupting chemicals, and shown that we can, just by the changing what foods we eat and how we prepare them, you can bring these levels down. There's also another side of this which is extraordinarily important, and that is by reducing the food that we eat that has pesticides, we protect the farm workers. We protect the
Right.
farm workers' families. We protect people that live adjacent to fields, and those pesticides have been associated with ADHD, with preterm birth, with autism, with childhood leukemia. Uh, Pesticide exposures like that happen during fetal development have been associated with some of the most troubling conditions of childhood. So
Right.
by changing what we eat day to day, it not only is beneficial for our own health, for our family's health, it's also beneficial for the farmers that produce it and their families.
Mhm.
And those the farm workers oftentimes, because of heavier exposures, have an even greater health burden. So it's a way that a way that we can almost day to day have an impact not only on ourselves, the health of
Right.
farmers, and what we're also beginning to learn is on the health of soil. Right? So it's
Mhm.
what we do has a big impact collectively. Now, one person, one family doing this, will that make a difference? Probably not by itself. But if 10% of us, 20% of us um, begin to change the way we eat, it'll have a profound impact on not only public health, population health, but also on the planet.
You've said that so brilliantly, and it's something that we talk about often. We want to remember the impact, the connection that we have with other people, our community, and our planet. And that those little changes, those little shifts, exactly as you say, those little shifts in our behavior, we can impact the planet and how people do business, where they spend their money, because money always talks, right? And it
Yeah.
tends to talk pretty loudly. So, speaking with our pocketbooks, but I love remembering that even that simple choice of buying those organic strawberries versus conventional can help so many people down the path. It's that domino effect, right?
Yeah.
This is just talking more about the impacts on the body. I think are pretty extraordinary, and I love the idea of helping people not be overwhelmed. Just pick a few things out that you think that you can do in your day to day life. And actually, what comes to my mind, Bruce, is I would love for people's homes to actually become, if you can think of it this way, as a place where you can go to heal. almost. That you make so many changes in your own home about how you eat, about how you clean, about how you furnish your home, that coming into your own home really gives your body a break. You know, you're able to use air purifiers, you're able to use water purifiers. So that time that you give your body a break and you give your family's body a break gives it a chance, an opportunity to recover, to rebalance, to even, dare I say, to heal, you know, whatever might be ailing you. So I love this idea of truly making your home a safe haven. And every time you come into it, it's giving your body, even if you're exposed to other things outside, even that little break can make a huge difference in your overall health.
Because the way we regulate chemicals today is we assume that there are safe levels or thresholds, right? It's an assumption, not based on any evidence. It was just an assumption made 50 years ago. And it was a reasonable assumption 50 years ago. We didn't know any better. We didn't have any evidence one way or the other. But now, with lead, for example, there's been over a dozen studies that have looked at this question. What happens as blood lead levels increase in children? And we see the same pattern, these steep decrements, whether it's in IQ scores or in academic abilities, no evidence of any threshold. And so in 2012, the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control declared there is no safe level. Well, now we're seeing that same thing for air pollution and coronary heart disease, benzene and leukemia, tobacco and preterm birth, lead and coronary heart disease. So now there's this growing list where we see no evidence of a threshold. And indeed, there's actually greater increases in risk at the lowest measurable levels. That's where the exposures are occurring. And that's
Mm.
why we have to start focusing on these very small concentrations of exposure among people who aren't yet sick, right? Because here's the thing that just blows my mind still when I think about it. The majority of diseases that kill us today are man made. The majority of diseases that kill us today are man made.
Mm.
At the turn of the 1900s, coronary heart disease was extraordinarily rare. Lung cancer was extraordinarily rare. Diabetes was highly unusual. These diseases have arisen not because of genetic changes, but because of changes we've made to the environment. Now, that's both troubling. What are we doing to ourselves? And it's hopeful because if these are man made, and I say man made intentionally, I didn't say human made, I said man made because these were often done at a time when men were making the decisions.
Mhm.
It's hopeful because if these are largely man made diseases or problems, that means that we can solve them. And we have to recognize, though, the vast majority of our research oftentimes is focused on treatment, on genetics, on stem cells. But if these diseases are largely man made, that is, they are from environmental triggers, we should be focusing much more on those triggers, on things outside of us, not just on our genetics. And let me give you an example. For autism research, for example, the first 10 years of the 21st century, 2000 to 2010, there was over $1 billion spent to understand the etiology of autism. Over $1 billion. 96% of those dollars were spent on genetics, 4% to understand the environmental triggers. But our genes don't change quickly enough to explain this rapid rise in autism. So, why are we studying genetics? Why are we putting so much of our health dollars, our research dollars, into genetics?
Mhm.
Well, I don't know. I can't figure it out, to tell you the truth, other than if there are drugs to be made, then there are profits to be made. If
Right.
we prevent autism or other conditions, um, we all benefit. Society benefits tremendously, but nobody's figured out how to privatize those benefits.
Right.
And so, if your health system is set up on the free market, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to be driven by where the profits are. And this gets me to one of the points that I think is most important, and where I think parents and mothers in particular can have the biggest impact. And that is to begin to ask ourselves, Would I prefer more investments for drugs that might ultimately help to alleviate childhood leukemia, autism, ADHD? Now, don't forget, they're going to be expensive, right? We've all seen how expensive drugs are becoming or have become. Or would I prefer that my child never have these problems in the first place?
Right.
I looked for some surveys a few years ago that asked parents about whether they prefer prevention over treatment. And it's not really a fair question to ask when a family has a daughter, for example, with leukemia. Um, in that case, what we really want to be asking to understand this is, would you prefer that we had invested in finding ways to prevent childhood leukemia 20 years ago? We need to do both, but the point is that we haven't been asking parents about their preferences. And when we look at something like autism, for example, the vast majority of the dollars was spent on understanding the genetic risk factors, not prevention. My guess is that many parents, whether it's autism or leukemia, would prefer that their child never have some of these uh,
Right.
symptoms or condition like leukemia, but nobody's asking them. I think most of us believe that there's some laboratory that's studying these chemicals, these pesticides and other chemicals before they're put on the market. And for the most part, that's just simply not true. Most of them are grandfathered in. And most of them, even when they're put on the market now, are based on this assumption that they're innocent until proven guilty. Well, how do we prove them guilty? Well, that's the job of somebody like me. We have to go out, recruit. First, I got to convince the funding agencies to fund my research that it's important enough. And then I got to go out and recruit hundreds of pregnant women, measure these chemicals in their blood and body fluids and their urine, and then follow the kids up for years. And then I have to disentangle the impact of poverty or tobacco smoke and lead from these new chemicals that we're worried about. All right. So this takes decades.
Right.
And in the interim, of course, what's happening? Pregnant women, children, all of us are being exposed to these. And what we've seen is something we call regrettable substitution. So even if we just focus on pesticides for a minute, early in the 1900s, lead arsenate was used as a pesticide. Whoops, those are both poisons. Let's not do that anymore. What happened? DDT. Whoops, that's a poison, not only to humans, but to wildlife. Let's go to organophosphate pesticides. Now we're at a point where my colleagues, about 50 of us, said that we should ban organophosphate pesticides. What's being used now? Pyrethroids, neonicotinoids, glyphosate, and we're beginning to recognize that some of those are toxic. So we've seen this time and again where we've replaced one poison with another poison, but we have to study tens of thousands of people to find it, which means that inadvertently we're using our children, the rest of us, as guinea pigs to find out whether these chemicals are toxic. And that means, by definition, millions, millions or billions of people have been harmed before we act.
That's powerful stuff. And, it brings me around to what you have previously talked about, which is the importance of parents being empowered, taking back, taking back that power and controlling as much as they can what they're being exposed to in their families. So you talk about it happening at a grassroots level. And I remember thinking about this years ago and thinking the same thing. To wait for a change, you hope for a change at a state or a local state or national level. But in the meantime, you have to make the changes yourself, right? We have to be empowered at a grassroots level. And part of that empowerment is this education, this awareness and telling people, and then helping parents to be able to make those choices and make it as easy as possible, right? Because it can be overwhelming. So I think your perspective is pretty extraordinary here, and we've talked a little bit about trying to look at parents and looking at community-based solutions here. Do you think that parents and communities are really a big part of the solution moving forward to these harmful chemicals and getting them put away or and never used again?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you look back in history, I've become a real history buff around public health. What you realize is that in most cases, perhaps in all cases, it was only when parents and mothers in particular got behind a movement that we began to see real change in public health. Most of us
Mhm.
can remember, of course, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. But even before that, we had a bill passed, the first public health bill in this country. And it's not a surprise that it happened 2 years after women demanded the right to vote. And it wouldn't have happened except that women had the right to vote. And that act called for home nurse visitation programs, greater focus on maternal child health. And that led to some of the reductions in some of the diseases of childhood, like typhoid, for example. So we've seen this time and again throughout history. Uh, and the little things we do in our home can have a big impact. And ultimately, that's going to be whether it's through the pocketbook, whether it's through uh, sending letters to our legislators. The, the one hesitation I have about this is we really shouldn't be asking parents to have every parent, every family to have to deal with this burden on top of everything else they do. The ultimate solution is to uh, make the foods that we buy, the foods we purchase, uh, safe to eat. Uh,
Right.
the products that we use should be safe. Families should not have to become experts in toxic chemicals. But in the short term, that's exactly what's being asked of us because
Right.
we're failing to act on this evidence.
I look forward to the day that we don't have to, as parents, be focused on this issue as well as so many others. And I think the work that you do is absolutely critical to getting to that day. And I think I hope that the awareness that we continue to bring with our consultants to more and more people, who I continue to be so surprised at how many people are not aware of even kind of those most basic issues, the basic chemicals and the concerns that we have with them. So um, with that, Dr. Lanfear, I want to thank you so much for coming on here and sharing the incredible knowledge and experience that you have. I know that every one of our team and consultants really appreciate that, and know that you are making a difference in speaking with us. That we will take that message out, and while it adds to the burden of being a parent, I know that it will help so many parents to feel like they can have some sort of an impact on this issue by changing how they're thinking and changing the choices they're making for their families. So, thank you so much again for this time, and I'm sure we will talk again, though.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you for all the work you do and all your affiliates and team members. This is part of the movement that'll get us to where we want to go.